first presenter is Mr. Dennis Brezina, and he has been with Envirothon for so long, and we so appreciate you, Dennis, for being with us. If you could introduce yourself, you're really part of our Envirothon family, and we thank you so much for being with us again. We can't let go of you.
Well, I must be the bad side of the family or the black sheep or something. So Wendy had asked me to talk about soil health and renewable energy for a sustainable future, because I noticed that that's the additional item that y'all have this year. Y'all got a couple of other soil scientists that are going to do your soils portion this year. So I think that's great. I think that a lot of teachers that have been around for a while, like Tony, have kind of figured me out over the years. So it's probably good that you are going to get Sarah and Tyson to come over there and do that. Cole's also a good guy for that. I do have a disclaimer. I am not a subject matter expert on renewable energy, but I did stay in the Holiday Inn Express recently, so we'll see what happens with that. I kind of think of myself as being a 90-day expert on this subject, because after Wendy contacted me about this, I've gone through a lot of stuff for this as I could, but we'll see how it goes. But again, I may not be able to answer all of your questions about it. Jonathan Swift said everything old is new again. And I think about that. Bell bottoms are back in style. Trucker caps are back in style. Mini skirts, vinyl albums. My kids are buying vinyl now and that. And so it's been cool because I've just gone ahead and recycled the ones that I had, and they actually like to listen to some of the same stuff that I listen to. And then also, what about like soil health and energy? Is it old and new again? And, soil health is really just kind of like a new look at an old practice, because Thomas Jefferson used turnips and buckwheats and vetch as cover crops at Monticello in 1794. He had written to John Taylor that I think it's important to separate my exhausting crops by alterations of crops, of cover crops, ameliorators, and that. So it's not really a new practice in a lot of ways. It's just a new way of looking at an old thing. Kind of like an introduction, in 1500, when the Europeans came here, bison population was estimated to be somewhere between 30 and 60 million. Well, who was fertilizing all that grass and that? And, that's some of those things that we don't really think about, that we don't necessarily have to have a lot of external inputs into those things. Soil health is the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living system, and it sustains plant and animal health. And there's 5 main principles of it. Is to cover the soil, keep the soil cover, or armor the soil, minimize that disturbance to the soil. Doesn't necessarily mean eliminate the disturbance, but fewer trips across the field. If you're plowing, the fewer trips, the better. No-till planter is a lot, even much better. And then using plant diversity, looking at 4 different species types and functional groups, and keeping a living root in the ground year round is we're finding that so important, that the biology associated with living roots really does make a difference in soil health. And then finally, livestock integration. Sometimes you'll see livestock integration included in with the diversity. They'll just list it as diversity instead of plant diversity. But there's typically, a lot of times we'll talk about it, that there's 5 items that are there. And I'm really not going to talk a whole lot about soil health on this presentation, since I wasn't sure if it was going to be something that y'all were going to be needing to talk about. I have kind of tried to make the main focus of my presentation to be on biomass energy, which is the oldest, most widespread and practical form of renewable energy that we have. Humans learned to control fire for warmth and cooking and protection, and we know at least 1 million years ago. And there's some studies that point to that's about 1.5 to 1.7 million years ago, so even older than they thought that they've had. They've been able to find ash that they know in caves, so they know that humans had to bring that fire into those caves to be able to that. So that's where we know that it's at least 1 million years ago. But those biofuels are fuels that are produced from renewable organic material. So that's the primary definition of biofuels, if you will. Biomass can produce renewable electricity, thermal energy, and also transportation fuels or biofuels. The biomass is a living or recently dead plant or animal organism, and any of those byproducts from those organisms. Of course, biomass encompasses all living things. We're part of that as well. And that biomass energy, though, refers to the use of those crops, residue, and other biological materials that can be used as a substitute for fossil fuels in the production of energy and other products. Our living biomass, our plants take in carbon as they grow, and they release that carbon when it's used for energy. And it can oftentimes result in almost a carbon neutral cycle that does not increase the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. And that's where the sustainably grown part comes in. That's why I put that asterisk there, because as long as it's being grown without a lot of fertilizer inputs, without a lot of chemical or production inputs into it, it's much more carbon neutral then. The energy that's stored as biomass can be released to produce that renewable energy as electricity or heat. We've also got biopower that can be generated through combustion or gasification of dry biomass or biogas, such as methane, and it's captured through controlled anaerobic digestion. Co-firing of biomass is a big item as well. They'll usually co-fire biomass with coal, and it's a low-cost means of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It improves the cost effectiveness, and it also reduces the air pollutants within existing power plants. Thermal energy is another item in heating and cooling. It's often produced at that scale of an individual building, especially at the power plant site itself. Through that direct combustion, they'll often use wood pellets, wood chips, or other sources of dry biomass for that. And that is generally referred to as a combined heat and power operation. And the efficiency of that use of biomass is usually around 80% of the potential energy that's there. So it's a pretty good percentage of capturing of that energy. The facilities can capture that waste heat and or steam from that biopower production and pipe it into nearby buildings to provide heat, or to chillers for cooling as well. As far as the economics of biofuels, the positives are to reduce the undesirable effects of fossil fuels production and use. We want to control greenhouse gas emissions. Also, it's going to be an exhaustible resource depletion that we're using with the fossil fuels there. So we know that there is an end in sight. It also reduces our dependence on unstable foreign suppliers and some of those other things that we don't always think about. Another positive of biofuels is that this is an increase in farm income for farmers and ranchers. But there are some negatives to it as well. The feedstocks do require land, water, and other resources. It sometimes leads to changes in land use, and that might actually increase the greenhouse gas emissions. As a change, last year, Central Texas looked like Iowa. There was so much corn being grown last year. It was just amazing to me to see the amount of corn that was grown last year. Of course, another negative, it also puts some pressure on water resources, air and water pollution, and it can increase our food cost as well. And then also biofuels emit, in some cases, the biofuels can emit more greenhouse gases than the fossil fuels. depending upon how they're grown. And that's more considering if they're using a slash and burn type situation where they're actually clearing the land to plant these biofuel feedstocks and that. And that's not necessarily very common in the U.S. to see. Our transportation fuels can be produced from biomass, so that can help alleviate our demand for petroleum products and also improves that greenhouse gas emission profile. And then there's also a possibility that biofuels can be a source of clean, renewable transportation energy until we produce a significant number of electric vehicles to run on renewably produced electricity. So that's just kind of an overall input into the biofuel in general in that. There's 3 different generations of biofuels. The first are sugar crops and starch crops, such as sugarcane, beets, corn, and sorghum. The sugar and starch crops are converted through fermentations to form bioalcohols, so ethanol. Ethanol is the most widely used bioalcohol fuel that there is. It's being used a lot, especially in the last 20 years. And then also oils and animal fats can be processed into biodiesel. This also includes used cooking oil. And it's got to be important when you're hearing in the news about the theft of used cooking oil, that this is important because obviously those restaurants are selling that used cooking oil. So now it's become so important that there's theft of that. So it's amazing that we've turned so much that way to where we're looking at those different biofuels in this way. Other oils can be taken from oilseed crops such as soybean, sunflower, canola, and then also animal fats as well. Our second generation are cellulose biofuels, but we've had commercial cellulose biofuel production that began in the U.S. in 2013. These are coming from your non-food crops, such as switchgrass and wood products. It also includes waste biomass, such as corn stover, corn cobs, straw, and wood byproducts. And then it also goes into include non-food feedstocks, such as municipal solid waste, or MSW. And then there's also fast-growing trees, such as hybrid poplar and willow. And these do not need fertilizers to grow. So that's the big item on there to reduce that greenhouse gas. That can also include lawn waste and disaster debris as well. So these are all items that can be used as cellulose biofuels. Our third generation biofuels are primarily using algae as that feedstock. It's not yet commercially being produced. One of the drawbacks is it's expensive to harvest. There's also shading issues, and you need a fairly expansive area and a large amount of space in order to grow these algae in that as well. The algae biomass is composed of carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids or natural oils. And the bulk of that natural oil is a microalgae as a form of triglyceride. But it does show a lot of promise in producing biodiesel. So that's a potential that algae has. There's potential economic benefits. They're produced from renewable feedstocks. So it's not something that we're going to run out of, and it could be sustained indefinitely. Our second and third generation biofuels can reduce those greenhouse gas emissions, and waste biomass has no additional agricultural production requirement. So that has a tremendous amount of indirect mediated greenhouse gas emissions in that sense. Biofuels can also be produced domestically, so we wouldn't need as many fossil fuel imports. And as biofuel production and use reduces our consumption of imported fossil fuels, we're becoming less vulnerable to those adverse impacts of those supply disruptions. And in reducing our demand for petroleum, It could reduce the price, and so that's economic benefits for our consumers. And it could also increase our petroleum exports to other countries as well. So there's a lot of things there that it's not necessarily that it's trying to kill petroleum production in the U.S. It's utilizing that petroleum in a different form where we're actually exporting it. Some environmental benefits. Obviously, we talked about it reducing the emissions. Ethanol can also have a complete combustion, so it's reducing those carbon monoxide emissions. The biofuel production and use, it must coincide with the reduction and production of the use of fossil fuels to reduce that greenhouse gas emission and or other conventional pollutant emissions. It lessens those petroleum imports and it alleviates that pressure on our exhaustible resources. There's also bio-based products as renewable substitutes for those things that are made by petroleum and natural gas. So there's bio-based foams, and plastics, fertilizer, lubricants, and other industrial chemicals as well. We've already mentioned how it can reduce our dependence on foreign oil. The energy differs from other renewables as it's tied to farms, forests, and other ecosystems from which those biomass feedstocks are obtained. The use of biomass has the potential to result in a wide range of environmental and social impacts, both positive and negative, above that use as a substitute for fossil fuels. It does impact your soil and water resources. It affects the biodiversity and the ecosystem function, and it can affect those local communities as well, depending on what choices are made, as well as where and how they are produced. And a key item there is the biomass must be produced and harvested as sustainably as possible. In that sense, that sustainability is choosing management practices that minimize those adverse impacts, and they complement your local land management objectives. So you're really wanting to look at farm preservation, forest stewardship, food production, and wildlife management in the process. There are disadvantages. Many of the crops that would otherwise be used for human consumption or as animal feed. I mentioned how much corn was grown in Central Texas last year. If it was used to produce biofuel, well, then that's taking it away from the source's animal feed. Most of the crops grown in Texas are used for feed or fiber. It's not so much used for food type stocks. These types of corn is grown more as a feed. But diverting those crops to biofuels may lead to more land area that's devoted to agriculture, and it could also increase the use of polluting inputs and leading to higher food prices as well. We mentioned cellulose feedstocks, but those also compete for resources, your land, your water, your fertilizer, and that could all be used for food production as well. Our changes in land use patterns may increase the greenhouse gas emissions by releasing terrestrial carbon stocks to the atmosphere. So again, that's if land is being cleared to grow a biofuel feedstock, and that clearing and subsequent cropping will generate greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not such a common thing here in the U.S., but it is being done in other countries. There's also biodiversity losses in that land conversion, and then there's also biofuel production and processing practices that can release greenhouse gas emissions, especially if chemical fertilizers are applied. Mentioned the higher crop prices. Models show that these estimates, though, are wide, and it's a 2013 study found that projections for the effects of biofuels on corn prices could range from 5 to 50% increase on the price of corn. And then there was a report in 2011 finding that 20 to 40% increase in corn prices from biofuels between the years of 2007 to 2009. Now, you have to remember that that period was during the Great Recession when gas and diesel prices also increased. And so those increased fuel costs also bring in increased fertilizer costs as well. So there's a lot of strings attached in these things. It's not just necessarily the movement from using these crops for feed, animal feed and food production, to using it as a biofuel production and that. So there's a lot more things involved. But this is that food versus fuel debate that comes into conflict within the sites. Our agricultural land may be shifted from producing food to the production of dedicated energy crops. The use of those agricultural crops and lands has contributed in part to the increased prices for these commodities. Other factors that contributed to this increase are also inflation and increased prices of fossil fuels. Oil and natural gas in the form of fuel and synthetic fertilizers are two of the biggest economic inputs in food production and distribution. So, when Russia invaded Ukraine, that affected the price of oil and natural gas as well. So there's a lot of outside items that are affecting to that. But if we can reduce that conflict between food and fuel production, we can include an increase of use of agricultural waste, logging residues, food scraps, and the MSWs and using marginal lands for this production. We're not taking so much away from our food items that we're looking at. There are policies that are being used to support biofuels. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 included economic incentives and income tax credits and subsidies. The Energy Independence Act of 2007 was similar to that. And their goal was for us to increase our biofuel production to 36 billion gallons by 2022. And we're only about halfway there right now. So something we did 15 years ago, we're only about halfway to that. In 2022, U.S. ethanol production totaled about 15.4 billion gallons, and combined biodiesel and renewable diesel only totaled about 3.1 billion gallons. So some of it is a supply and demand. The demand is not quite there yet either. So that's another one of those items that we're looking at. Another issue that's heavily associated with biomass production is greenhouse gas emissions from the land management and land use change. Those direct emissions refer to those resulting from land clearing or our agricultural inputs, such as fertilizers, or management practices that are undertaken in the process of growing or harvesting a biomass crop. Indirect emissions are associated with market-driven land use change. These are emissions that occur when forests, grasslands, or other ecosystems are cleared to produce crops or other commodities, to compensate for land use that was diverted to that energy production. Our biomass markets will add to the value of biomass products, and this value will help to improve the economic viability of working lands and act as a positive incentives to help preserve farms and forests from the accelerating threat of urban sprawl. And that urban sprawl is actually the greatest land use impact that we're having. We lose acres and acres as Harris County expands, Montgomery County expands, the Dallas-Fort Worth area and Austin markets expand. So we're losing farmland in those cases as well. Wanted to include this. This is from the U.S. Department of Energy, and it includes a map of biomass resources within the United States. A lot of that is, of course, tree related, where we have forestry production. You can see that in East Texas and Louisiana and through much of the South right there. But then you also see a lot of dark blue in Bexar County. They're along the I-35 corridor going up to Dallas-Fort Worth. as well, and almost any other metropolitan area. And so what they're looking at there is the municipal solid waste that's generated, and the way that we can utilize that for biomass resources as well. So this was a really interesting map that I saw that I wanted to include as well. Another item that I wanted to include was biofuel energy production in 2022. And so the U.S. and Brazil, and then along were some of the highest production of energy biofuel in the world in 2022. So it is happening in that. So it's just one of those things that's taking a little bit of time. Again, your biofuels are those biomass materials that are called feedstocks. Most of our biofuels are used as transportation fuels, but again, they can also be used for heating and electricity generation. In 2021, about 17.5 billion gallons of biofuels were produced in the United States, and about 16.8 billion gallons were consumed. And we were also a net exporter of about 0.8 billion gallons of biofuels in 2021. Fuel ethanol obviously is accounting for the largest share of that gross and net exports of biofuels. So that's why we're seeing so much corn being grown these days. Most of the biofuel consumption occurs as a blend with refined petroleum products. So, E85 gasoline, biodiesel or bio-added diesel, or heating oil and kerosene type jet fuels as well. Well, that's some of the items where they're really trying to expand upon is adding these products to jet fuel to make them more efficient as well. But some biofuels do not require blending within their petroleum counterparts. When the diesel engine was first developed, they were actually using plant oil to run the diesel engine off of. So there are possibilities that you can use these as well without blending them to those fossil fuels as well. Wanted to include a couple of graphs there. This is just showing the biofuel production in the U.S., and you can see from the early 2000s a huge increase in fuel ethanol being produced. The light blue is your biodiesel. So you see that being included as well after about 2010. And then renewable diesel has also started to come in the last 10 years as well. The graph on the right is our consumption. Consumption has also increased along with that production. Again, ethanol is your largest consumer, followed by biodiesel and renewable diesel as well. The U.S. Energy Information Administration published data on 4 major categories of biofuels. Ethanol, of course, that alcohol fuel that's blended with petroleum gasoline for use in vehicles, and accounts for the largest share of biofuel production, 85%, and consumption, 82% in 2021. Biodiesel is blended with petroleum diesel for consumption and accounts as the second largest share of U.S. biofuel, about 11%, and in consumption, 12% in 2021. Renewable diesel is chemically similar to petroleum diesel. It's used as a drop-in fuel of a petroleum diesel blend, but it's kind of small right now, but it is growing in U.S. production and consumption as well. And right now, renewable diesel percentages share production and consumption were about 3% and 5% respectively. Then we also have other biofuels as well, such as renewable heating oil, renewable jet fuel, which sometimes is called sustainable aviation fuel or alternative jet fuel, also sometimes called by biojet. There's renewable gasoline and other emerging biofuels that are in various stages of development and commercialization as well. So there are a lot of things on the horizon as well. I think this is the last graph that I have showing biofuel imports and exports. Until about 2010, we were importing a lot of ethanol. We're still importing a little bit, but primarily now we're exporting ethanol. So there's that push of why we're seeing so much more corn being grown. But then you can also see that we've got a lot of biodiesel exports since 2010 as well. We are still importing some renewable diesel imports, and we are doing some biodiesel imports as well. That development hasn't quite caught up to our use during this time. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and because I mentioned switchgrass earlier, and most of the public had never heard of switchgrass until 2006 when President George Bush mentioned it in the State of the Union address. But the biology and adaptation of it, it's adapted to much of North America. Everything in green, there's areas where switchgrass is grown, but primarily you're looking west of the Rocky Mountains and below south of the 55 degrees north in that. The late growth also, it's not really it's the positive of switchgrass is it's not a food crop. And also too, once it's late growth, once it gets older, it's not really palatable to livestock. So it does show some adaptation to being used as a biofuel. It's a warm season grass. Again, it's native to North America, so it's not something that was introduced. It grows from 3 to 10 foot tall, and then also too that yield potential can be taken on marginal cropland. So you're not taking cropland out of production in this case. It can be grown west of the 100 meridian with irrigation, but if you're adding irrigation, you're adding items into it that would affect that as well. So it's not really something that's feasible to that. One way to think about switchgrass is think about your original prairie extent. The areas in dark green, you'd be able to grow switchgrass without a whole lot of input. And as you start to lighten the green that you had in the Midwest, in the midgrass prairies and the shortgrass prairies, it basically doesn't exist in the shortgrass prairies except along streams and that. So again, our feeding fiber crops are grown in all of these areas, but they're also being primarily grown in those dark green areas as well. Just a little comment about the loss of ag land. There is a conservation reserve program. It's administered by our sister agency, the Farm Service Agency with USDA. This was created in 1985. It's one of the largest private land conservation programs in the United States. It's a voluntary participation by farmers and landowners. And for a yearly rental payment, farmers are taking marginal cropland out of agricultural production and planting species to control erosion and improve the environmental health and quality of the soils that are there. These now they're 10 to 15 year contracts. When it originally came out, they were 20-year contracts. The long-term goal of the program is to reestablish land to prevent soil erosion, improve that water quality, and improve the wildlife habitat. And of course, this is to take marginal land out of production. So we're already taking land out of production for this particular program. That's the point that I'm trying to make here. And you cannot graze or harvest these areas until that contract lease expires. But after that lease expires, this could be used as a feedstock also as well for this type of production. Current total acres of CRP enrollment is 24.8 million. And in 23 alone, the agency enrolled over almost 4 million acres into CRP. This is showing just the amount of money that's been paid to agricultural producers and landowners to take that marginal land use out of production. And that after the contract, the producers can leave it into grass, and they will often either graze or hay it, but oftentimes they will put it back in cropland for a short time. And in some cases, they are able to re-enroll it into CRP for an additional payment or contract. The item that's coming up that we're finding now, the land generally qualifies for organic production after the length of that 10 to 15 year contract. And what we're seeing in a lot of cases is our producers growing an organic crop on that land, and they'll grow it for 2 to 3, maybe 5 years, and then they'll put it back into CRP. So this again was just kind of showing that you're not less, when we mentioned that feed versus food versus fuel point, you're not really taking agricultural land out of production if you're using it for these feedstocks. Just in summary, biomass can be used for bioenergy, either renewable electricity and thermal energy, and also there are biofuels for transportation. There's 3 generations of biofuels. The production, consumption, and export of biofuels has increased over the last 20 years. There are both positive and negative land use issues in production of biofuel feedstocks. And then waste biofuel feedstocks offer a sustainable alternative to the production of feedstocks in general. And then, so no one went through a lot of items, but I've got several different references in here that I use for this. These are primarily the ones that I used in the presentation right here. And then I also have a second list of references for additional information. These are just things that I've looked through that kind of supported a lot of the items that I mentioned. I think you will all be able to utilize this. And feel free to contact me if you have any questions. Again, I do not consider myself a subject expert on renewable energy, but at least tried to give you a start on that.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Can we open it up to questions for Dennis?
Yes, you said that switchgrass has low roots and ribosomes and can form a sod. Like, what is what is a sod, and why is that a beneficial thing? Like, what is sod?
Well, sod is the when we think of soil, it's not just the mineral component of that soil. It's also including the inert matter that's in there, the organic matter that's within there, and then the root mass as well. So that root is living inside that soil. So it's taking that concept of we have a tendency to think of soil as just being a medium that we grow things in. It's inert and it's just some kind of solid mass that we grow things in. But there's a lot of living items within that soil. And so there's where that sod is. And so it's a combination of the root mass that's in there that's forming that sod. Sod can also be used as a definition just to include like where you're using it to plant the grass that's in you. And so you buy sod from a nursery. But generally, when it said sod in that case, it's talking about it also including the roots within the soil to make that sod. Hopefully, I answered that well enough.
Yes, thank you. And then I did have another question. When talking about the CRR and the loss of farmland, you talk about a category of land that's marginal cropland. What is that? Like, how do you define like a marginal cropland?
Okay, that's going to be really difficult to go to give an answer in just a few minutes. But we have different classifications of farmland. We will classify our land from 1 to 8. And classes 1 through 4 are considered cropland. Class 5 would typically be our floodplains. It's soils that are flooded at least every other year, and so production of cropland is difficult in those areas because you run such a risk of it being flooded out. And then classes 6 through 8 are generally either too steep or too eroded, or they're too dry, or there's something else that we cannot economically farm a crop on those. But those class 4 lands, you're really looking at only being able to farm a crop on that 1 out of 4 years in those areas. So that would be a marginal type farmland. And those areas are actually probably better off being utilized in a different area. So a lot of times they'll plant it to pasture, and they'll maybe grow hay on it, or they'll graze cattle or other livestock on those types of land. So most of our farmland is on those classes 1 through 3, just for that very reason. And so that kind of in a nutshell is the probably the easiest way for me to describe marginal cropland. I don't know. You may have had another question in there too, but I know the marginal land was the part that I caught on that.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Those are my questions.
Okay.
I got a quick question about the food prices. It says kind of doing the biofuels for food versus fuel. Are there incentives to drive the market one direction or another? I know the market is very flexible within the rates per bushel for whichever way it's going, but is there a policy or some way that's driving it? We'd rather have it done as this, or is it based on quality and what they want to input to that quality of food versus fuel?
I think a big thing is it's year to year. Last year is a great example. We started off like gangbusters with the amount of rainfall that we were getting in the early part of the year, and then it just completely dried off in June, and in early June too. And corn is generally needing rainfall into mid-June at least to produce a crop. So while they produced there was a lot of corn being grown last year, much of it ended up as silage instead of actually going to where you produced they were able to produce an ear, but it wasn't an ear of corn that had a lot of corn kernels in it, and so it got produced into silage, and they can still use silage in biofuel or bioenergy production, but you have to have that site to take it. And so most of that silage ended up as feedstuffs for our animals instead. It's a lot easier for them to make that. They'll use that to make cattle cubes and different type and horse cubes and stuff like that as well. So there's where a lot of that ends up getting used in a case like that. Hopefully, I answered that question well enough on that.
Definitely, thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Dennis very much for that fascinating, very informative presentation.
Thank you again, Dennis.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank y'all for having me.